Okay, welcome everyone, and many thanks for joining us this event. This is hosted by the University of Bath, the Institute for Policy Research. My name is Aida Garcia-Lazaro. I'm a research fellow here at the Institute for Policy Research, and I work in topics related to AI, the labor market, and therefore this event is very fascinating for me. So I'm delighted to be joined by James Muldoon. He is a reader in management at the Essex University. He's also a research associate at the Oxford Internet Institute and an author of the co-author actually of the Feeding the Machine, the Hidden Human Labor Powering. He has also published a more recent book, Love Machines. So we encourage you to read both books. They are very relevant for this discussion. So hi, James.
Hello, thanks for having me.
Thanks for accepting. So some logistics for this event. James and I will be in a conversation for about 40 minutes before we open the floor for some questions from you. You can submit your questions in the Q&A box. And please state your name and your institution if you like. Amy, who is in the background helping us today, she's going to collect the questions and pass it to us. As you know, the event will be recorded, so later you can see it in the IPR YouTube channel. Please subscribe if you haven't done so, and like it if you enjoy the event. Okay, so this topic is very exciting for me because lately we've been thinking about a lot on AI and this powerful machine that is helping us to automate various tasks in our daily task. And when we think about AI, we usually think about at least two things. One, ChatGPT, Claude, Gemini, these friendly and shiny front faces that help us to answer almost any question. But what really entails this technology, what is inside and what is behind that, that's what we're going to discover with this book. And the second thing is that when we think about AI jobs, we usually imagine people working in Silicon Valley, London, with great salaries, maybe software developers, programmers, engineers. But this book is challenging and is showing us an alternative view of how behind all that there is a big amount of people working behind the scenes with very low conditions, with very low salaries, and we wanted to get a view from James about that. So the first thing I would like you to ask, or I'd like to ask you, is if you can give us an overview of the book. And I understand this is a joint project that you run with your colleagues, Mark Graham and Callum Kant. So if you can talk a bit about that, the floor is yours.
Great. So the book is called Feeding the Machine, The Hidden Human Labor Powering AI. And the central thesis of the book is that we would like to show an alternative perspective on AI, one that we call the supply chain perspective. Tech executives would like us to see AI as an engine of wow, as something that creates out of nothing, that possesses a superior form of intelligence. What we would like to do is take these marketing slogans back down to earth and reveal the material infrastructure and the hidden environmental, human, and social costs that it takes to power AI. The book is really about taking a perspective behind the scenes where we get to meet seven different workers at different points in the AI supply chain, to tell a story about all the different types of labor that are required for AI to function. One of the cornerstones of the book is the work that we do with data annotators. These are people who label and prepare and curate data sets to train algorithms that make AI systems like autonomous vehicles and large language models possible. And this work is often outsourced to various locations in the global south. We visited several centers in East Africa, in Nairobi, in Kampala and Gulu. But this work exists all over the planet. It exists in Venezuela, in the Philippines, in India, and lead tech companies in America and Europe will send this work out there in order to gain access to a cheap, disciplined, and unregulated labor force to help them do this kind of work. So the book is really about trying to expose what are the working conditions here, how is AI possible through this kind of labor, and what kinds of ethical and political issues does this give rise to?
Thank you, James. And touching on the annotators. First of all, it's fair to say that the book is structured in 8 chapters, and each of the chapter is dedicated to one of the occupations that you consider relevant for your work, right? And so the annotators is super interesting because it shows exactly the horrible conditions that people in this part of the supply chain is facing. So Anita, who is the annotator, is facing issues with surveillance and with monitoring. Could you expand on those? Because there seems to be what is called now the algorithm management, no, in that part of the job.
Yeah, well, let me give you a bit of background about this particular chapter of the book. So, I already mentioned that data annotation was one of the key topics here. Anita is the data annotator who lives in Uganda that we tell the journey of. Um, but zooming out a little bit, what this research was actually undertaken as part of a project called the Fair Work Project. And this is based at the Oxford Internet Institute. It's where Callum Cant, my co-author, was a postdoc. It's where Mark Graham was a professor and director of the project. And the Fair Work Project is involved in rating digital platforms. So platforms would be scored out of 10 based on the working conditions they offer for their workers, with the hope that low scores would eventually name and shame the platforms into improving conditions for workers. So this has been ongoing for a number of years, and it had primarily rated digital labor platforms. So we can imagine Uber, Deliveroo, things like that. When we turned to AI platforms, we started to look at what types of work was being undertaken in the AI industry. And data annotation was one of the chief forms of work. And so a data annotation company called Sama agreed to take part in a scoring. So we were given access to interview dozens of workers, team leaders, managers. We interviewed the CEO. And I think the expectation here from the company was that we would come away and see how amazing the working conditions were and how what an incredible company they were, and that indeed they were delivering on their promise of giving an ethical AI system for data annotation. And I think there was a little bit of a miscommunication somewhere between the senior leadership who were based in San Francisco and the middle managers and workers who were based on the ground in East Africa. Because when we got there and when we actually spoke to the workers, it couldn't be further from the truth. Workers spoke of, long hours, boring, repetitive work, getting paid little more than $1 an hour, not getting paid the living wage as the company was claiming, facing, a cruel system of surveillance and targets, being rated every day for speed, efficiency, quality, having your name up on a board, which was either in green or red as to whether you were like meeting your targets or not. And the targets themselves being dynamic. So in that the bottom 10% of workers were structurally, by configuration of the system, always failing to meet their targets, right? So you couldn't meet your target if you were in the bottom 10% because the targets would just be moved if people started completing the tasks more quickly. Workers were also on 1 or 3 month contracts, so there was no job security, and there was a huge pool of available workers that would be called upon as workers would be rotated out or their contracts wouldn't be renewed. So what this created was, rather than a picture of job quality and security, it was a culture of fear and concerns with the workers that no matter what they did, it was never going to be good enough. So this annotation system just felt incredibly pernicious. And in the end, the company actually got scored a 0 out of 10.
Mhm.
And it took some negotiation and back and forth where they had a 3 month period where they could basically make changes, and then we would score them again, and both scores would be published. And so in the end, they improved a lot of the conditions, and they ended up getting a score of 5 out of 10. But this was the
Okay.
basis of the annotation work and some of the key experiences about how outsourcing works as a global industry, and how this work is outsourced from places in North America and Europe to, various locations around the world.
Very good, thank you. So on that, two questions. What are the incentives for companies to improve their scoring? It's because it's published, or what is really the effect for them, and therefore, like, how do we trigger any change?
Yeah, so it's basically like an NGO, but Mark calls it a participatory action research project. But it's the central mechanism behind it is leveraging the authority of the University of Oxford's brand in
Mm.
order to create an incentive for the companies to score better than their competitors. So, the Mark and the team rate, every company in the industry, and some of them just don't care and will get a 0 and just go on their day. But many of them actually will kind of call up or write in and say, "What can I do to improve my score?" Because these companies, they have like PR people, they have brand managers, they have people sitting around whose job it is to worry about these kinds of things, right? And
Mm, yeah.
maybe if I, I'm at the University of Essex now, maybe if we did it, no one would give two hoots about getting scored by an academic at the University of Essex. But the UK is such a hierarchical and classist country that, anyone does anything at the University of Oxford and people take note. So it's really an exercise of leveraging that brand in order to create pro-worker changes at these digital platforms.
Yeah, no, thank you. And that brings me to another topic, that is market power, no? That's on the line, that's what you're basically talking about. And in that chapter, you talk about connectivity. And when we bring that word to the contemporary discussions in economics, we always think that connectivity is key to trigger economic growth, develop economic activities, etc. And that's also true in the economic history, no? So countries that had these well-developed transport systems, they grew faster. But then the problem with that is that there is a misinterpretation of what that entails for income distribution. So you discuss the views of Thomas Friedman about free trade, connectivity, internet, and how that would level the play field for all the participants. But then you have a comment where you say equal connectivity doesn't make equal market power. Because people in these locations, they have internet, but they are not reaping the benefits of AI. What could you tell us about that?
So I think what I was saying in the book is interrogating the conditions under which different participants get to participate in the global value chains of AI.
Mm.
So this is drawing on Latin American dependency theory, in that we're arguing that when you look at the development of new technologies like AI and others, um, there is a very specific configuration of the value chain where the majority of the value that gets produced and captured is actually happening in the core countries around Silicon Valley in North America and a few select other places. But that the work and the labor that goes into all of this, things like producing the products, looking at other technologies, making the iPhones in southern China, mining the minerals in Central Africa, refining the minerals back in China again, or where it comes to AI, annotating the data essentially for these data sets and doing a lot of the quite boring, repetitive, low pay, somewhat low skill work. All of this kind of stuff gets outsourced to what you could call the periphery of the global economy, to countries and enterprises that do not have a lot of market power, that do not have large amounts of capital, they don't have access to the kind of networks of funders and other resources and capital. They really have access to their labor and to small amounts of equipment that they can use, laptops, computers, factories, things like that. And that the condition of their participation in these global networks is that they'll only ever be able to do the boring, repetitive, low-paid work because they just don't have the access to other powerful actors in the network to be able to create, the Silicon Valley of Africa, right? Because it doesn't serve OpenAI or Anthropic or any of the other large tech companies' interests to, find ways to basically create all these competitors around the world. And so what we try to think about here is how broadband and how fiber optic cables can be seen as another technology of connection, which, in a very similar manner to previous technologies of connection, where we're thinking about railroads or the telegraph or even just old shipping routes, they connect the world in a global economy, but one which is not flat, right? The global economy is not flat, it's not free, it's incredibly hierarchical and incredibly structured. And it will dictate the conditions under which people can participate. And so we saw that kind of legacy of colonialism and of uneven development and uneven trade agreements to be very much present in the most advanced form of technology today.
Yeah, no, totally. I fully agree with that. And I think in that part you mentioned, well, first of all, we know that with globalization, not everybody won, right? So that's first said. And obviously, we could expect something similar with this new technology. And I find fascinating and horrendous at the same time when you compare the this AI supply chain with the European colonialism. Is that I suppose it's a rhetoric question, but is that terrible? Are we in front of the modern slavery conditions?
If I understand your question correctly, I think it's important to see the continuities and the legacies of colonialism. So we wouldn't go far as to claim that this was some kind of modern day slavery or equivalent to forms of slavery practice in the colonial era. Nor is it a kind of forcible seizure of lands or a destruction of language and culture. What some of the Latin American coloniality scholars mean by coloniality is it's the kind of ongoing presence of the legacies of these systems that still persist in the present. So rather than saying, uneven trade practices and data annotation outsourced to the global south is colonialism. I think it's more that the kinds of hierarchies that existed then persist today. And so I think one classic example of this that we try to show is this image of the first fiber optic cable being laid in the port of Mombasa in Kenya. I think in 2009, almost 100 years after a very similar technology of connection. The Ugandan Railway was started there at the turn of the century, over 100 years ago. And I think when we look at this kind of colonial era versus modern technology of connection, what we see is a innovation that has been sold to the people as something that will connect them to the global economy, as something that will bring them jobs and prosperity and access to opportunities. And this is how the Kenyan elite class sells the benefits of fiber optic cable today, right? That it will expand their data annotation market and their business process outsourcing market and give people access to jobs. But it's not giving people access to start their own, start AI startup. It's giving them access to a very specific type of low-paid work, which people don't want to do in the States, or that they think they can get it done much more cheaply and easily, and with less unions and less regulation, in other parts of the world. And so in each case, we see a technology of connection, which actually doubles up as the technology of power and control. And so I think that is key to understanding the colonial legacy, right? It gives rise to another international division of labor, this time of digital labor, where certain types of jobs and conditions are made available for those in the center of the global economy, and another set are made available for those in the periphery.
Yeah, no, totally. And I think that is like a second tier, no, of jobs. And that brings me to another element that you mentioned, that within this, division of labor, that is the data centers. This discussion is relevant because there are quite a lot of data centers that have been established in Latin America, but also it's a discussion in the UK from last year, where as part of this idea of the UK industrial strategy to make AI a top priority, we need the resources to propel the AI machine, and therefore we need data centers, no? So could you tell us what a data center is? What is the type of jobs that are in these data centers? And later we talk about the resources needed for.
Sure. So a data center is a bit different to what I have been talking about. I've been talking about data annotation. That's a facility where tens, sometimes hundreds of people sit at computers and work on individual tasks where they're curating data sets. So they might be tagging things in street scenes, or they might be answering questions for a ChatGPT clone. But they're all kind of working at their own computer. A data center is more like a computer system where AI workloads will get sent. So it's just a bunch of servers, basically, kind of lined up in racks. And they don't employ many people. There's just a small handful of engineers and technicians that will kind of supervise the data centers. And often they can be quite small, but they often range to like incredibly large hyperscale sizes. And these centers will manage workloads from multiple enterprises. So it's the job of the data center technicians at AWS, at Amazon's web services, that they will manage workloads from multiple companies. And so these data centers are necessary both to train the models. When a new model is being trained, that requires a lot of capacity, and in also handling inference. So when you're making requests of an AI model, a server needs to handle those requests, and that also takes up a lot of capacity. The main issue that people have with data centers is how much water and electricity they use, right? And also the kind of, perhaps we could say, the false promises of jobs and opportunities for the local community. Because the truth of data centers is, while there are some manufacturing jobs when they get constructed, they're not huge employers, right? As I said, there's only like a small handful, like a skeleton staff that will be employed there. So it's not like I don't know, like a Walmart is moving in, or some kind of big employer, as mining and manufacturing used to be. So one of the other issues is they're incredibly electricity intensive, right? We've all heard the headlines of how much power and energy they will require, of the kind of tenfold increase in electricity usage that will be over the decades to come. On average, a kind of standard data center will use about 80,000 households, American households, of electricity in any given year. So it's like a small town is kind of setting up next to you. And this I guess is gives rise to the politics and resistance around data centers because I think there's a lot of debate at the moment around how much water they use, and I know those statistics are very contested at the moment. I know the Empire of AI author, what's her name, Karen Howe, has kind of been through the rinser on X because of a kind of misquote of by an order of magnitude of how much water was used. But electricity certainly is a huge concern and something that I think will continue to be debated as more and more data centers get built.
Thank you. Yeah, and precisely, no, that's precisely the contradiction. So we are not actually benefiting much the local economy, but there is an extraction of resources. So there is a point in the book when you call AI as a extracting machine. And my feeling is that is in part for the amount of natural resources needed, no? And yeah, you.
Yeah, so I mean, one of the central metaphors that we use of the book is that we call AI an extraction machine. You thinking about because I didn't come up with the title "Feeding the Machine." We had done all the work, and I wanted to call the book "Humans of AI," right? Like the Humans of New York and Humans of other series. I was like, "Humans of AI, perfect." And the publisher was like, "No, we don't like it. It's too similar to the Humans of New York IP." So they came up with the title "Feeding the Machine." And when they did that, I was like, "Well, if we're going to have machine in the title, we should make it more of a part of the book." And so at that point, we were thinking about images and metaphors that would help convey our central argument. And the whole point that we realized as we had done all these chapters is that at every point, when we think AI is kind of akin to magic and creates something out of nothing, the precise opposite is true. It's incredibly extractive of a whole range of things, right? Of the natural resources, of electricity, of water, of human labor, and also of human intelligence, right? The entire life cycle of an AI model is based primarily on human data, right? It's all the books that we wrote, all the songs that we've wrote, all of the articles, newspapers, right? It's just repackaging that and using what other people have done, often unacknowledged and uncompensated. And so when we wanted to bring that insight much closer to people's consciousness for what they thought of when they thought of AI. So we wanted to basically have this central metaphor when after you've read our book, every time you think AI, you think AI extraction machine, something that lives off human labor, human intelligence, and natural resources and repackages them for profits for tech companies.
That's a very nice and alternative way to understand AI, because we need to see what is behind that, no? Not just looking at the what sort of task can automate for us. So you mentioned also some elements talking about natural resources, of particularly mineral earths that are relevant to the next phase of AI and the global race for across global leaders. No? So it's interesting to see in the book that China at the moment controls around 90% of the market of cobalt, no? And also a majority of that is done or mined in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And we know for the recent news that there is a conflict going on there. And the same for other locations that have those resources. So how this discussion is contemporary to the conflicts that we are living right now.
So I think one of the fundamental geopolitical transformations of the past years has been an attempt to re-territorialize or renationalize different elements of the supply chain, right? So it's why America has convinced TSMC, the chip manufacturers that supply NVIDIA with chips, who were primarily based in Taiwan. It's convinced them to build factories in Arizona, also in Japan, I believe, and potentially a third place, maybe Germany. I don't know. Definitely Arizona and Japan. And America and many other countries have also attempted to explore how different parts of the supply chain could actually be brought back onshore. So if not onshore, then at least friend-shored, right? Because it's
Yeah.
true that China, I mean, one of the major bottlenecks that China has isn't just mineral extraction, it's mineral refinement. I think 90% of key critical minerals get refined in China. And so, if there was a kind of rising tension, as we've seen between America and Iran, it could have catastrophic consequences for the global economy, just as the US war on Iran has with in terms of the oil supplies. You know, if the US tried to had a similar kind of escalation of tensions with China, and China said, okay, well, you know, we're hurting and we're prepared to hurt you and everyone else in order to achieve our strategic objectives, no more access to our mineral refinement, that would essentially shut down global trade as we know it. People are, you know, politicians around the world are searching for viable alternatives, but in some of these cases, it's just the fact that like there isn't a lot of this, these minerals around, things like lithium, um, cobalt, as you mentioned, there are only a few countries in the world that have them in large supplies. So it does create these tensions and these bottlenecks that are essentially quite troubling for technology companies that are looking to produce these products.
Yeah, totally. Thank you. I see. Yeah, and Venezuela and Brazil and other Latin American countries are
Hmm.
particularly rich in those minerals. Let me to move to another part of your book that is more related to the creative industries. There is another occupation that becomes relevant, no? The artist. And so we have a participant in the study called Laura. She's a voice artist that, thanks to a horrible contract that she wasn't aware, she gets all the rights to reproduce her voice. Tell us a bit about that. And that's particularly relevant because even in the UK, the creative industries, that is a large share of the market, is going to have effects for the economy. No? So, yeah,
Yeah, so
sorry.
just to reiterate what you said, we spoke to we spoke to many voice actors, but one story that we tell in the book
Yes.
is of Laura, an Irish voice actor who, during the pandemic, when many people were out of work and really struggling to get by, she signs a contract with one of the large tech companies to do some voice work for them, one of their products, and the tech company hands her this like 100-page document. As always, we don't read every single line of the document. She assumed that it would have generally fair conditions. She knew the main terms, signs the document. One of the terms that Laura unfortunately didn't read that the company had put in there was that they would own the rights to her voice in perpetuity forever. And so a couple of years later, she gets a call from one of her friends, and the friend says, I'd like to ask your advice about working with an AI company, because I'm thinking of doing it myself. And Laura's like, "What? Sorry, what are you talking about? I've never worked with an AI company." And the large tech company had actually taken her voice, used the recordings they had for their own product, synthesized an AI version of her voice from a model, meaning that they could now allow the model to say anything they wanted in whatever intonation and tone they wanted. And they sold that to a third party in China, I believe. And so now a Chinese company was selling the rights to her voice to whoever would pay for it for about $20 a year. And these other people could then use a voice which was synthesized from her own voice to say whatever they wanted. So Laura was in effect competing with an AI version of herself, right? And so rather than getting the kind of wages that you would expect as a creative professional, right? So this would be hundreds of dollars a day. A client basically has the option, well, do I hire Laura to do a really nice artistic rendition? Or do I have a product that is lesser quality but will get the job done and I'll pay 20 quid and that'll be that. And so as you can imagine, Laura is indicative of, huge parts of artistic creative industries where we've just seen an absolute decimation of their sources of living, of all the jobs. There are graphic designers, copy editors, um, who else there? Like other creatives. I think the voice actors were the kind of canary in the coal mine, because voice synthesis, has improved so much over the past couple of years. But the problem here is that so much of the creative capacities of AI is literally just an algorithm that's ripping off humans, right? So if you've produced like 100 works of art and someone comes along and says, "Oh, can you do a painting in the style of James Muldoon?" It's literally just going to do that because it's stolen your work, basically. And so, of course, we have all of these copyright claims that are before the courts. I've had quite a detailed look at some of these, and I really do think that creatives are up for a really difficult fight in any jurisdiction, trying to show that training AI isn't fair use under the fair use exception. I don't think many of these creators are going to have much luck with this because, by the definition, by the interpretation of the law, obviously they're complicated cases and some of them remain to be decided. But some of the initial decisions have not been very promising, I will say, because there are jurisdictional issues. But it honestly just looks like judges are interpreting it as a kind of fair use because there is a fundamental transformation of the product. They're not replicating, they're using it to train something that is then able to create its own. And of course, it's still a
Mhm.
kind of theft ultimately because they're uncompensated for the most part. But it's a difficult legal case because the copyright law was written before we had machines that could do this, right? It was written where people were just worried about things being directly copied. And so while you might say we've gone from A to B to C, and AI is basically just like skipping a step, it's a really tricky claim.
It's another form of extraction at the end, no? 'Cause yeah,
Exactly, exactly.
they taken the intellectual property, no? And in cases like Laura, because of these contracts, is a much more difficult case because she signed, no? So it's also we need to be careful what we agree with the big companies.
Yeah.
Let me to take you to another part of the book that is the one that we most likely relate to. So the engineers. So there seems to be that these people are in highly paid jobs. They have very good lifestyles. They can, in the book, is very compelling the description of the fitness level, the lifestyle, and all the shiny bits that someone in those occupations has. But then at the same time, Lee, that is an engineer, faces also some challenges because she's aware of the annotation market, about the safety issues, the ethic concerns, but she knows the company is in a race. And everybody is in a race for delivering the product and being innovative, and at a global level, companies want to be the first one. So, what are really the chances and the power of these type of workers to change the dynamics within their positions?
So I think if there are going to be any changes to the working conditions of workers in further out in the supply chains in different countries around the world, it's going to have to come through transnational acts of solidarity between workers in the global north and the global south. Unfortunately, what we considered or what we saw all too often was that workers in the global south were not in the kinds of structural positions of power to have their voices heard. That even when they protested, even when they organized in their own companies or in, through their own union movements, it was just so easy for the lead tech firms in the global north to simply move somewhere else or dust the issues under the rug. It was, incredibly disheartening to see, when we were doing our field work, the kind of, levels that people were going to organize, and how ineffective they were in some cases. How difficult it was to struggle against these kinds of conditions because firms would just threaten to move to another country, right? If workers were too difficult to manage in Kenya, they just go to the Philippines. And so this threat is very real because this is their livelihood. It's not just a kind of game for them. Many of these workers would rather the jobs in not great condition than no job at all, right? And that's kind of part of the disciplinary mechanism that keeps them working. Um, and so when you think about the kind of power that someone at Google DeepMind, which was, quasi the example that we used in the book, it was like a tech worker working in London. I think, you joined the dots. It was something like Google DeepMind. I definitely had a few people in my mind when I was writing that description of that worker. Um, if you're one of these people, you probably, you're in the kind of circles where you like might know a Guardian journalist and that you can tell people on the weekend who would write about things. You would be connected to people in political parties. You would be connected to people in high up in the field of technology. And so you just have access to so many more resources to cause embarrassment for your company. People care a lot more if you're a kind of London-based or an American worker and you're organizing with others. The kind of Amazon and Google employees who were trying to unionize, they'd get, headlines in national newspapers, right? When people organized against Israel's military or against kind of other ethical issues about AI being used for weapons or military or things like that. These are the kinds of things that, tech companies are really worried about. Because it's very hard to get top level talent in AI. And if you start to get all of your engineers thinking the same way, telling you, the senior leadership team, that they're not going to do X, Y, and Z, that's not good at all, right? And so it's a whole different calculation about the kind of power and impact that certain forms of work or organizing can have. And I think it's important to be realistic and pragmatic about those different levels of power. And I think what it really pushes for is the necessity of these workers that find themselves, in these positions of power to act in solidarity with those who aren't. That there are actual huge similarities in the struggles, not necessarily the conditions, but certainly in the structural position and the kind of struggles and the interests of workers in the global north with workers in the global south. So one thing we do argue for in the book is, the necessity for trying to find more of those commonalities and to work alongside each other and to support each other's struggles.
Absolutely, yeah, and from London, from America, from everywhere, no, to be more conscious about all the people working in the industry at the different positions and the disadvantages that they might have as well. So, what about policy makers, the government? We understand that AI is global, so there needs to be a supranational attempt But what is your view on that?
So we don't have a supranational government or world police. So unfortunately, we can't just make a law that covers the whole globe. But there are ways in which you can do this. I think some of the most promising are thinking about various supply chain acts in the global north. So the EU recently had a corporate directive in relation to human rights abuses and human trafficking in supply chains. Um, and we have looked at some of those laws. Unfortunately, a lot of them are quite loose, or the standards are very minimal. It's basically mainly about human rights abuses rather than good, fair conditions for workers. But I think, what we really found was that um, change could, when it did happen, it usually happened from the top down. It happened when regulators basically stepped in and said that firms were not allowed to do X, Y, and Z, and so they had to change. Or when the tech firms themselves started setting conditions which their suppliers had to follow. So I think putting pressure on tech companies in the global north is also a really necessary and important step in addition to strict and binding regulation. um, these tech companies sometimes do respond to pressure. Some of the benefits that we saw workers having in Nairobi were the result of one of their key clients basically setting a series of conditions that workers had to have a set number of breaks, that they had to be able to have access to a counselor, they had to have a minimum pay, which was a little bit higher than some of the other workers. So that all came from voluntary action from one of the lead tech firms. So while voluntary action and naming and shaming is not enough on its own, it did produce some results. But of course, the gold standard is regulations that will enforce these better working conditions.
We need to find a way to develop or trigger those incentives for companies, no?
Mm.
So it reminds me a bit of what happened with climate change. Years ago, not many companies were interested in taking any action in favor of the environment. But now that it matters for the financial indicators, for how the companies are seen, and now that people is more aware of choosing the companies where they are buying items, that has become more relevant. So somehow we need to find a way that companies, and I guess that's another question, no? From the consumer side, because we all are consuming AI tools and goods. Is there any action that we can take in place to improve also the conditions of workers or attempt to?
Well, the most obvious recent example is what happened with OpenAI and Anthropic and the Department of War. And so, ChatGPT saw its subscription numbers plummet in the millions. But I think the problem is that a lot of these AI companies are kind of as bad as each other. It was not altogether clear that Anthropic are actually any better in the kinds of contracts. I mean, they were the ones that were in the Department of War to begin with. So I'm really not sure. I mean, surely their products were used in generating these kill lists. So I just don't know how. I guess consumer action is always so limited, right? There's rarely been good examples of consumer boycotts that have been super effective. Um, and I think it's quite similar in the world of AI. But yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, okay, thank you. There are a couple of questions in here in the chat. Um,
Should I answer them or do you want to choose ones for me?
I mean, yeah, let's go by the first. Uh, it says, are data centers hot to work in? You can take a talk about the conditions within the data centers. For a reason, Iceland is chosen as a location.
Sorry, what was the Iceland question?
Are data centers hot to work in? Are 80 those American households energy use more like Well, I mean, it's just a comparison about the consumption of energy and whether the requirements of
Oh wait, sorry, yeah, I can see it now. Sorry, I
yeah.
was looking at the wrong thing. Data centers, no, so the servers generate a lot of heat, but often the centers are designed so that the engineers are not like sweltering in that heat. The data centers we visited in Iceland, um, were, the reason that they go to these Nordic countries is because the temperature is a very stable and cool temperature of about 0 to 10 degrees all year round. And so one of the benefits of that is that they use less energy in cooling the servers because the fundamental thing that the energy is used in is cooling servers, right? And so if your data center is based in a country that it's already quite cool, you're going to save a lot of money on that. Let me just go down the list. So Maddie says, could you tell us a bit more about the data annotation work and what this involves for the workers? So it could be anything for, one good example just to make it more live is imagine autonomous vehicles, right? So they do a whole lot of data annotation. In order for the computer in the car to see the road and to understand what's going on around it, it needs to be able to read street scenes with videos, right? So the car has cameras that are kind of looking all around, and to train the model, you just have to train it on thousands of hours of street scenes. And what you have to do is draw what's called bounding boxes or kind of um, annotate street scenes. So it's like, that's a tree, that's a child, that's a street sign. This is like the lines on the road. And these have to be manually annotated, right? You would think that AI would just like look at a scene and understand everything. Not at all, right? In order for the machine learning algorithms to effectively see the road or to process data and to interpret what is happening. It takes thousands of examples. And so, in order to get 1 hour of annotated road footage, like a video, it takes 800 human hours to annotate that 1 hour video. So you can imagine how many hours and how many workers would be required to sit there looking at a street scene and drawing a little box around a tree, drawing a little box around a child, coloring the lines on the road to show the algorithm what to do. And so you can translate that into a whole variety of different industries and applications. So think of like retail or shopping, right? You need to show a computer algorithm what an apple looks like, what a banana looks like, what a restaurant plate of food looks like when it's empty, what it looks like with different types of meals on it. To language, pictures, music, all of this kinds of stuff. So this is the kind of stuff they do, and they do it for hours and hours at a time without any break, with minimal breaks, for incredibly low pay, and they do it for years on end, right? So some of the annotators we were talking to were like 6 years in, and they had literally done this 10 hours a day, often 6 days a week. They walk in from their village like an hour or 2 hours out of the city. They wake up at 5. They do this just all day, basically no breaks. Finish at 6 or 7. Don't get home till 9 or 10. I mean, this is the one of the problems that we were kind of talking about.
Yeah.
South Park Regional Library, something happening in the US is salaried work turning into gig work. Yeah, this is also happening, right? So one thing we,
Transformation. Yeah.
yeah, one thing we see is that the kind of gigification of labor and of work is coming to all these different industries, right? Because as soon as you can parcel what used to be a stable career and a stable job out into a series of micro tasks, you can eliminate all of the employment protections and all of the kind of additional pay and sick pay and holiday pay and all of this kind of stuff. And you can just thrust the risk and the security problems back onto the worker. So you say, I'm not going to pay you X number of dollars a year. I'm going to pay you, $2 per task.
Yeah.
And getting the fuel for your car, bringing the tools, worrying about if you get injured, worrying about if you're sick, that's all your problem now, right? And so this kind of came, well, firstly, this what gig work or um, piecework has always been the the conditions of labor for many people in the global south. It's not like it was invented by tech companies, but it has kind of been brought to the attention of the industrial north a lot more in recent years, and has been kind of expanded in many respects. Do you think things will get worse or better in the coming years? I mean, we're
Yes.
almost starting World War III. Obviously, it's going to get worse.
It's definitely, yeah, the chances to get better.
Yeah. I mean,
Well,
God, who knows? I think as a social scientist, your main job is to interpret causal connections between past events. So I don't see myself as a futurist. I wouldn't have any more idea than anyone else, but it doesn't look good from my perspective.
there is a final question here
Yeah.
about the spatial AI. It
Yeah, I'm
says,
interested in this, to be honest. So the question is, would the development of spatial AI or so-called world models that learn on video data, would this solve the problem of extractive labor in AI? Not really, because, every AI model requires some kind of annotation, right? If anything, it would create more it would create more annotation tasks, right? Because how do you think these spatial AI models are going to be trained? They're going to require a whole bunch of spatial data to be annotated by humans. And you could say things, and so something that people claim often is, well, AI is just going to get so smart that it will be, able to annotate its own data or able to train itself, or there'll be synthetic data that AI will be able to create. And it really depends, right? In certain industries, in certain use cases, maybe, right? But the problem with AI is always in the kind of final 10%, right? All of the edge cases, all the tricky cases, all the difficult stuff. And I think you would be surprised about how often there are actual humans that are just impersonating AI, because it's really not that good in certain types of tasks, right? Anything that requires anything where the objectives are not very clear, it is going to struggle. Anything where things are very context dependent, things are very tricky. One thing changes if a set of conditions change. All of that kind of stuff means that you're always going to need humans in the loop dealing with the messiness, dealing with the tricky edge cases where you are going to need someone to kind of help to keep trained the models. Is there an
there's,
alternative to AI?
yeah.
Um, of course, it's called the outdoors. You just go out there and there's no AI at all.
Uh,
Um,
we didn't talk about the moderation or moderators. It's another question. I'm aware of the time. So,
Should I just quickly address the content
yes, yes.
moderators?
Yeah, yeah, please.
Yeah, so one could call content moderators AI workers in a sense, because there are algorithms that are involved in moderating content, but I think it's a real unique case, right? And we did talk to content moderators in East Africa. It's unique because their job isn't just boring and repetitive, it's incredibly traumatizing. And so, what content moderators do is they trawl social media networks and look at the worst of humanity, from violence to sexual crimes to suicide, child, all kinds of stuff, right? And they basically tag it for the worst violation of the company's policies so that it can be potentially taken down from the network. And, workers that we talked to were, had to complete one ticket or one item every 50 seconds. And so in a 10-hour shift, you're literally seeing hundreds and hundreds of horrific, you know, videos, pictures, descriptions of violent and disgusting acts. And, the workers that we spoke to were absolutely traumatized by this. They had their lives turned upside down. They couldn't sleep. They, fell out with their families. They lost their partners. It fundamentally changed who they were as human beings. And these are people that are getting paid little more than $1 an hour, right? So this is a very specific case of quite horrendous digital labor that has rightly gotten a lot of media attention because it's awful, it's often undignified work, and it's not treated with the kind of pay and respect that it should be.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, James. I think with that, we close the discussion. On behalf of the IPR, I would like to thank you for being with us today. Show us what the book is about, and please, all you can have a look at the event in the YouTube channel, subscribe for new events, and thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Aida.